for today, good afternoon once again. Let us discuss the module number 3 in Computer Programming 11b. Now, when you think in what we call the object-oriented manner, again, as I've mentioned, everything is an object and every object is a member of a class. Ano nga bang tinatawag natin na object? I mentioned what an object is. Object in the sense of programming, anything is object. Say for example, yung system.out point line natin. The word system, it's an object. The word out is an object. The word print line is also an object. You can also think of any inanimate physical items yan, as an object. Say for example, ito, di ba? Literally, your desk, your computer, and the building in which you live are all called objects in everyday conversation. You can also think of living things as objects. Your houseplant, say for example, your pet fish, and your sister, di ba? They are objects. And now, events are also objects. Say for example, yan, the stock purchase you made, the mortgage closing you attended, and the graduation party that was held in your honor are all objects. Now, the difference between a class and an object parallels between the difference between an abstract and concrete. When we say an object, it's actually the instantiation of a class. Okay? Diba we have here the public class and the name of the class that we are creating in any Java problems that we have. Now, an object is basically an instantiation of a class or one tangible examples of a class. Later on in as our module or our discussion actually progresses, makikita natin kung ano nga bang ibig sabihin or paano nga ba gumawa ng program that has an object, how to create an object, how to instantiate an object, and what a constructor is. Now, objects can also be a members of more than one classes. Say for example, yan, yung goldfish natin, it's not just simply a fish, but rather a vertebrate, or also called an animal. Vertebrate is an object. Animal is an object in a sense of programming. Okay? Now, we'll be studying this concept in greater once nandun na tayo sa introduction to inheritance na topic natin. Now, the concept of a class is useful because of its reusability na tinatawag natin. Objects gain their attributes from their classes, and all objects have predictable attributes because they are members of certain classes. Now, in a sense of object-oriented programming, sometimes you can create classes so that you can instantiate any objects from them. And other times, you create those classes to run as application. Application classes frequently instantiate objects that uses the objects of the other classes. Now, magpapakita ko sa inyo ng sample classes natin dito, sample program. Makikita natin na every time we are creating a Java program that uses an object-oriented programming concept, hindi lang isang class ang gagawin natin. For face-to-face classes, pinakita ko sa inyo kung paano gumawa ng method that can, or another class that will be called inside our main method, diba? Now, say for example ito, many programmers you have seen so far since CP11a, ito, many programs, have used the system class, diba? So, you didn't have to create it or its print line method because both were provided for you by Java's creators. Yun nga, yung sinasabi ko kanina, diba? Say for example, yung word na system, kung titignan kasi natin yung word na system in any programming language. For example, dito, itong system na to. This one, itong system na to, once you click on this one, once you control-click on the system, magpapakita kasi dito yung system.java. The system.java is actually a separate object or a separate class that is already built in the Java virtual machine. And that is also included in the Java development kit na tinatawag natin. Now, instead of us programming or coding this entire thing, which is like around 1,000 lines of code, 2,400 to be exact, all we have to do is to simply use the system class, di ba? In any particular method or in any particular program na ginagamit natin. Di ba? So, yun ang kagandahan ng paggawa ng mga objects natin. So, parang kumbaga shortcut niya instead of you putting every single thing dito, di ba? Ito kasi built-in na to. Yeah, that's a good thing about Java as well. Yan. Diba? Now, you can also identify a class that is an application because it contains the keyword public static void main. And the main method is the starting point for any application, as you all know. Now, let's go here. Let's move on dito agad sa may part ng creating a class. Okay. Now, When you create a class, you must assign a name to the class. Ano nga ba yung ginagawa natin para maka-assign ng name, di ba? That's actually the same name ng Java file na ginagawa natin, di ba? Every time we are right-clicking, for example, you right-click on this one and you click on new and you create a new Java class, the name of your Java class will now be automatically created as the name of your Java file as well. Now, you must determine what data and methods will be part of the class. Now, suppose you decide to create a class named employee, for example. One instance variables of employee might be an employee number, and two necessary methods might be a method to set or provide a value for the employee number and another method to get or retrieve that employee number. See, for example, to begin, you create a class header with three parts. So you have here the optional access specifier that can be the public, the keyword class, and any legal identifier. So, any legal identifier means anything na gusto mong pangalanan ng class mo, diba? So, for example, we have here public class employee. So, we have the access specifier. When we say public, it can be accessed by any part of their programs. Class, it's actually a class, diba? And the word employee, it's any legal identifier. Now, the most liberal form of access is actually public. The keyword public is a class modifier. Classes that are public are accessible by all objects. So, public classes also can be extended. Mag-aaralan natin yan soon, di ba? Or used as a basis for any other classes. Now, tignan natin to. We have here the private class employee, and an employee, as you all know, has its employee number. So, kung napansin natin, we have a class, public class employee, and a variable, empnum. Pero, nag-declare sila ng variable dito na empnum, pero nilagyan nila yan ng access specifier, which is private. Diba? Meaning, assigning private classes to a field means that no other classes can access the field's values, and only methods of the same class are allowed to set, or the get, or otherwise use those private variables. Now, pag ganyan kasi pinag-uusapan natin, that is what we call the information hiding. In Java, you can declare any parts of the information, or you can actually hide any parts of the information by simply putting private. 'Di ba? Ang alam naman kasi natin, any employee number or any ID number na meron tayo sa isang company or sa isang student, for example, all of them are unique and cannot be duplicated. Diba? Because employee numbers are only set as a single number for a single employee only. So meaning, syempre, kailangan natin yung i-declare as private para hindi na ma-access yan ng iba pang classes in the future. Okay? Now, in summary, class data fields are most often private and not static. The exception occurs when you want to use a non-changing value without being required to create an object. So in that case, you make the field both static and final. Now, let's move on to what we call creating instance methods in a class. Diba? Now, besides those data, classes contains methods. Say, for example, one method you need for an employee class that contain an empnum is the method to retrieve or return any employee's empnum for use by another classes. So, a reasonable name for this method is getEmpnum, and its declaration is public int getEmpnum. Ito, di ba? So, we have here a method, getEmpnum. Naglagay tayo dito ng public as its specifier. And of course, a data type, which is integer. So, if the data type is integer, automatic, alam na naman natin na we have to put a return keyword kasi we are trying to return a specific value. Diba? Now, because it will have a public access, return an integer, yan, and possess the identifier, getEmpnum. Now, similarly, you need a method which to set the empnum field. So, ito, you have a getEmp. Of course, you have to create a method that will now set the value of employee number. See, for example, itong public void set empnum, integer employee na nakikita natin. We have here the EMP number or employee number. You will now pass the value of, kumbaga, pag tinawag mo to sa main method, di ba? Tapos the set empnum. If you call this method in the main method, of course, you will also pass a value. So, for example, the value is around 20. The 20 will now be stored in the variable emp and will now actually get by the variable empnum. Ito, empnum natin. So, empnum is equal to emp. Okay. Now, public int get empnum. Okay. Ang ibig sabihin nito, kung napapansin natin dito, the value of empnum is actually 20. Now, in later on in your main method, there is also another set of code that will now also get the value of empnum that will simply return the value of empnum here, which is 20. Okay? So, ito yung mga tinatawag natin na mutator and accessor methods. Mutator methods are actually, mutator methods are actually a method that will set or change the field values. Remember that. Set means mutator, get means accessor methods. In Java, mutator methods are often called setters, and they conventionally start with the prefix set. Yan, prefix na set. Accessor methods are called getters, setters, and getters, and they conventionally start with the prefix get. Required po ito, lalo kapag gumagawa na tayo ng classes with different data fields, of course. Now, non-static methods, on the other hand, are actually, those are the methods used with object instantiations. So they are called as instance methods. You can use either a static or non-static method with an object, but only non-static methods behave uniquely for each object. So you cannot use any non-static method without an object. So punta tayo dito, di ba? So when we say static is a keyword. It can also be used as an adjective. Although when we say non-static, pag gusto nating i-declare na non-static yan, there is no keyword. Okay, so, ano nga ba ibig sabihin ng static? Pagka static kasi, meaning hindi siya nag-change, di ba? Andun lang siya. The value is actually final. Static fields in a class are called class fields, pero when we say non-static, they are called instance variables. Kailan ba natin gagamitin si static method or si static na object or si static keyword? Once we like to have a value that should not change anymore. An example there is public static double pi value. Diba? Ang pi value is 3.14 blah blah, diba? So that is actually a static value. So we will be using the static method, static keyword for that one because it's not changing anymore. Alright? Say for example, when you create a class with static field and instantiate 100 objects, only one copy of that field exists in memory. Kaya nga static, di ba? Only one. When you create a class with a non-static field, however, and instantiate 100 objects, 100 copies of that field exist in memory. So, ganun siya. Napakadali lang na maintindihan ng static and non-static method. Now, let's take a look at this figure. Yan. It's actually an example how public, private, static, and non-static class members can be used by another classes. The figure shows a class named myClass, or test class. Ito, nakikita naman natin. Okay, that contains 4 methods that are public, static, private, static, yan, public non-static, and private non-static. So, tingnan natin. Let's move on. Let's try to take a look at this one. The public class test class. As you can see, the public class test class actually instantiated. When I say instantiated in programming term, that means we created. And we have created here a class with a name myClass, and we have placed there the keyword object, which is any legal identifier. So, pwede nyo baguhin ito. Again, I instantiated here the myClass, meaning nag-create ako ng panibagong Java file na ang pangalan myClass. And object is actually an identifier. Yun yung magtatawag lang dito kay myClass later on. Equals new. The keyword new simply means you are instantiating a new class. My class with a double parenthesis that looks like a method, pero in reality, it's a class na ginawa natin. Again, this is how you instantiate an object in Java programming. My class and object equals new my class. Instantiation. Now, let's take a look at this line here. Object, the pub non-stat method. Okay. The public non-static method can be used from test class with a myClass object. Saan natin makikita tong object na to? Si object, nandito yan kay myClass. Diba? So, punta tayo dito ngayon kay myClass na to. Itong myClass. Si public class myClass has the following methods. We have here public static, pubstat method, private static, private stat method, public pub non-stat method, and private non-static method. So, once you call that method, itong object, public non-static method, this is a valid, okay, valid call. Kasi you are only calling an object or you're only calling a method inside the my class. Yan, which is in public. So legit yan, pwede mong tawagin. How about ito? Object.public static method. The public static method can be used from test class with or without an object. So tingnan natin itong pubstat method na to. Ito. Therefore, we can call the pubstat method because the access specifier here is public. Diba? So, it's public. Kaya siya legal, valid yan. MyClass.pubstat method, ganun din, public static method naman ito. Ito rin, di ba? Object, public static. So, this is also a legal or a valid declaration or valid call. Kasi nga, kung nakikita natin maigi dito, kinocall natin lahat ng public na class. Pero tingnan natin ito, none of the following will work. See, for example, itong myClass.private static method, ito, private static method, yan. The test class doesn't have access to private method. Hindi siya pwedeng tawagin. Di ba? The non-static method cannot also be called. Yan. Basta, the idea here is that once you have declared an object which is in private, meaning you are not allowed to call that anymore. Hindi mo na siya pwedeng tawagin. Okay? So, nag-gets naman natin ang difference between public, private, and static and non-static. Diba? Now, the figure below shows a typical class that would use to declare an employee class containing one private data field and two public methods. Let's take a look at this example here. We have public class employee and we have the setters and the getters. So, yung private int empnum natin, this is actually a declaration or a variable. We have declared that variable as a private. Diba? So, kung titignan natin ito dito, itutuloy natin tong program na to dito. Okay. So, once we have created here or proceed here with the public class employee, you have here the private int empnum. You have here the private string emp last name, emp first name. Anong tawag dito? These are what we call data fields. Okay? Now, think of this way. Every time you are creating an object or a class in programming, you also have to think of the data fields na pwede niyang gamitin or in other words, the attributes of that particular class. Say for example, gumagawa ka ng program na related sa employee. Of course, automatic na yung nasa loob ni employee or yung attributes ni employee are the following. You have employee number, you have employee last name, you have employee first name, and you have employee salary. And since you don't want all of these information to be accessed by anything or by anyone outside the public class test employee as well, of course, you have to put private. Ito mga private na to. Diba? Now, every data fields, you have to create what we call the accessors and mutators. So you have here empnum. Kung napansin nyo, you have the set empnum, you have the get empnum. Emp last name, you have the set emp last name, and get emp last name. You have the emp first name, that's why you have created here the set emp first name, and you have the get emp first name. Diba? You have the emp salary, that's why you have set emp salary, and a get emp salary. Yan. That is how you organize classes in Java programming. Alright, so you have here the class object or the class name, and the only thing that you have to do is to simply provide the class the following attributes or the data fields that it needed. And of course, based from the data fields, you have to create the accessors and mutators of that one. Alright, so that is the way how you organize classes. And hopefully, alam na natin kung paano gamitin si public and the private and the static word, di ba? Now, this part here, you have the you do it part. Okay? This is actually, again, the part of our module that you have to do on your own. Okay? So, basically, ito lang yung parang pang supplement natin sa may topic natin na discuss ko ngayon lang. Okay. Now, let's declare an object and use their methods. Declare class doesn't need or doesn't create any actual objects. A class is just an abstract description of what an object will be like if any objects are ever actually instantiated. A two-step process creates an object that is an instance of a class. See, for example, first you supply a type, an identifier, just as when you declare any variable and then you allocate computer memory for that object. See, for example, you might declare an integer as int some value, and you might declare an employee as follows. Ito. So, employee, meaning you are actually calling the employee class. Some employee is actually a variable as well. And some employee can be any legal identifier, but objects conventionally start with a lowercase letter. Now, let's take a look at this example here. Dito agad tayo sa may program natin. So, in this statement, employee is the object's type as well as its class. And some employee is the name of the object. Also, some employee becomes a reference to the object, the name for a memory, address where the object is held. Now, we have here a public class declared to employees. Okay, you have public class declared to employees, and take note, you have a main method. So, everything will happen here. Although, kung napansin natin dito, kung itutuloy natin kasi yung program natin kanina, di ba, yung employee class natin, and this is actually the employee class. It doesn't contain any main method. Now, this is the main method. So, you have another class here that will declare to employees. Take note, you have an instantiation, or you have to instantiate an object, and by using the new keyword. So you have here employee. Yung employee na to, meaning you are creating a new object, which is actually the employee class. And this is the employee class that we have created earlier. This time, you are putting here a clerk name or legal identifier for the employee class natin. So, instantiation ng objects ito, no? Nag-instantiate tayo. Now, clerk.setEmpNum simply calls, okay, the setEmpNum method that we have created earlier, ito setEmpNum natin, and will now pass the value to the EMP, okay, to the EMP variable. And the empNum variable will now get the value of the EMP. Diba? So, nag-set tayo ng value. Ayan, nag-set tayo ng employee number kay clerk. Iba to, diba? Mag-iiba yan. Although, kung napansin natin, we have called the same method name setEmpNum, pero this time, you have used a separate object. Ayan, you have used a separate object, which is the driver. Diba? Ito, siniset mo yung employee number ni clerk na 345, pero ito, siniset mo yung employee number ni driver, which is 567. So, kapag ka ipiprint mo yan, hindi na yung set ang ipiprint mo, pero yung get na. Diba? Si get kasi nandun yung return method natin. So, the employee method is actually called a constructor. It's actually a special type of method that creates and initializes objects. Now, in pagka ginawa nyo kasi itong you do it na to, I have placed here the way on how we create a program that uses or that creates or that actually recreates this one. Kadugtong lang neto nung kanina nung spa services natin. Okay. Diba? So, ang constructor kasi, pag-aaralan natin yan in the next part of this module. This is very important because every time you are instantiating an object, every time you are instantiating an object, it's also mandatory, not really mandatory, pero somehow optional. It's somehow optional to create a constructor. Again, it's actually a it's a special type of method. Usually, initialization of objects and other variables happen inside the constructor. So, let's talk about constructor. Diba? So, when you create a class, such as employee, this one, and you actually are calling the employee class constructor that is provided by default. Take note, default by the Java compiler. So, a constructor establishes an object. A default constructor is one that requires no arguments. A default constructor is created automatically by the Java compiler for any class you create whenever you do not write your own constructor. Now, when the pre-written default constructor for the employee class is called, it establishes one employee object with identifier provided. Then automatically supply default constructor values. So, for example, ito, default to ha. Ang sinasabi ko dito ay kapag nag-create tayo ng class, Kahit na hindi natin gawin literally sa constructor, there will always be a literal, okay, employee constructor inside that one. So, automatic numeric fields are set to 0, character fields are set to Unicode, Boolean fields are set to false, and fields that are object references are set to null or empty. Yan. So, if you do not want each field in an object to hold these values, or if you want to perform additional tasks when you create an instance of any classes, you can write your own constructor, which I will demo later on. So, for example, ito, di ba? I have here a program, task sandwich. Yan. Tapos, nag-create tayo ng new object dito. Nag-create tayo ng object na sandwich. Then, ito yung sandwich.java natin. Again, the constructor looks something like this. Ito, public sandwich. This is actually where I will instantiate or declare the default values of the following data fields that we have. So, main ingredients, bread, and price. This is actually the sample problem natin na nandito sa module 3 natin. Okay, so another you do it class. I want you to at least do it after this lesson, after you have watched this lesson on your own, because this will really help you understand or have a better understanding on how constructor works. Anyways, may sample problem naman tayo, kaya pagkausapan naman natin yan. Okay, now let's try to understand that classes are also data types. Okay, the classes that you create become data types as well. So, parang ito, di ba? Once you have instantiated a new classes, this will also become a data type. Programmers sometimes refer to classes as abstract data types or ADTs. The abstract data type is a type whose implementation is hidden and accessed through its public methods. A class that you create also can be called a programmer-defined data type. In other words, it is actually a type that's not built into the language. Yan. Let's take a look at this example here. For example, when you declare a primitive type object, you provide its type in an identifier. When you declare an object from one of your classes, you do the same. After each exists, you can use them in similar ways. Okay. Ayan. So let's take a look at this example here, the sample program. Let's check. Ito. We have here public class methods that use an employee. Now, inside this class, we have here the main method. Okay. In the main method, you have actually declared an employee with my employee as the name of the employee. And you have actually instantiated an object. Diba? My employee, and not really instantiation, pero this will simply call the get employee data, which is also a method. Diba? This is actually a confusing way to create a program. This is actually, I do not recommend this one, pero pwede nyo pa rin siyang gawin. My employee object is passed to display employee method. So again, dito sa main method nangyayari lahat yan, no? Ang unang mangyayari dyan, my employee get employee data, this one, get employee data. Yan. It will now, this time it will now instantiate the object. This time, ang tawag dyan is temp-emp. And it will simply ask the user to enter employee ID and employee salary. So what will happen here is that the value of the temp-emp will now become a variable. Ayan. So pagkatatawagin natin yung value na in-enter natin sa ID in salary, na kay temp-emp yan. So ang i-return natin actually is si temp-emp. Ayan. So pagka i-display na natin yan, display employee, ito ang tatawagin yan. Employee at M, yan, will now get the value of the ID and the salary that you have actually inputted. Alright, so let's try to answer this sample problem here. So, you have to create a class. Tanggalin ko lahat to. Ginawa na natin to. Pero syempre, ulitin natin. You have to create here class name sandwich, and you have to create an application name test sandwich. Now, for those users of IDE, the very good way for us to, what do you call this one, to organize our classes is actually by simply, maximizing the use of windows. So, kapag dalawa or dalawang Java class yan, you can go ahead and drag and hold yung isang class and simply drop them somewhere sa window mo Para nakikita mo pareho, di ba? So, let's create a sandwich here. Let's create a class sandwich. Okay? I like to create here a public class. Diba? So, public class, you have the sandwich. Tama ba yung spelling ko? Yan. Now, inside the sandwich, according here, there are some data fields. String, main ingredient, string for bread type, and double for price. So, for the data fields, we have here string, main ingredient. You have here string, bread type, and you have here double price. According here, you have to include methods to get and set the value of these fields. Pero there are some default values dito, diba? Such as wheat, such as itong mga to for the following. So gawin na rin natin si test sandwich para hindi tayo malito. So public class test sandwich, which will also serve as the main method. Okay. So, dito kay main method natin, this is actually where we will now be instantiating the object sandwich. So, I'll name that as sandwich. Siguro pangalanan ko yan as sandwich then, new sandwich. So, nag-instantiate tayo ng object dito, no? Now, let's go here sa may, natin. This is actually the part where I'll be creating what we call the constructor. The constructor can be public, meaning it can be accessed by anyone. Yan, public sandwich. Now, si main ingredient kasi, this is actually where I will place the default value of the main ingredient. So, the main ingredient default value is like ganyan muna. The bread type default value is ganyan muna for now. And the price is actually 0 for now. So, include methods to get and set values. So, the setters and getters na tinatawag natin. You have here the public void set main ingredient. Okay? And let's pass that one to string ingredient, for example. And anong ginagawa ni set main ingredient? Since siya ang taga-set natin, we will simply get the value of the ingredient and pass that to the main ingredient variable. Ayan. Next is for us to create here the get. Ang get naman, ang get main ingredient natin, the return type for this one is actually not void but rather string. Diba? So get main ingredient. This time, ano ang kinukuha natin? Nothing. Because all we have to do is to simply return the value of main ingredient that we have placed. Next, let's work on with the bread type. So public void set bread type. And for the bread type, maybe we can actually name that as string bread. And we'll now get the bread type, will now get the value of bread. Okay. So, ganun lang naman siya, diba? Madali lang. Since string yan, we have here a public string get bread type that will now return the bread type value. Okay. Next, last one is the price. For the price, we have here public void set price. Okay. For the set price, we can just simply put here double PR. Siya ang magre-receive ng value na ibabato natin dito kay main method na to, di ba? So, we have here the price is equal to the PR. And since double yan, the return type will now be double get price. So, return price. Hopefully na nakuha natin, no? Na madali lang naman tong program na to. So, I want you to take a screenshot of this one after nating i-code. Yan. So far working na ang ating sandwich classes. Now, let's try to create here or let's try to take a look kung paano natin gagawin itong si test sandwich natin. According here, it will now simply create an application that instantiates one subject sandwich and demonstrate the use of set and get methods. So, we can just simply create here a simple program. Yan. a simple program that will now simply set the value of the sandwich and will now get the value of the sandwich itself. So, for example, ito, gamitin natin si sandwich. Let's set the bread type as, according dito, that is tuna. Okay? I mean, hindi pala bread type. Main ingredient pala dapat. Ayan. Main ingredient natin, let's set that as tuna. Ayan. Tawagin din natin si sandwich as yung bread type natin as wheat. According dito sa problem. And tawagin din natin ulit si sandwich object. Pero this time, set natin yung price at $4.99. Ayan. So, kapag gagamitin natin or tatawagin natin ang mga getters natin, we can now just simply put here a simple system.out.println. Diba? System.out.println that will now get the main ingredient. This time, tatawagin mo si sandwich that get main ingredient. Nakuha nyo ba kung paano? Ayan. So, next is for us to put here the bread type. Ayan. So, instead na ang tatawagin natin get main ingredient, ang tatawagin natin is get bread type. Next, yung price natin. We have here the price and the get price. There you go. So, if we try to run this one, right-click and run that, let's see what will happen. Ayan, nagbibuild na siya. Ayun. Diba? So, nandun na siya. Nakuha ba natin to? Diba? Ganyan yan. So, kapag ka gumagamit kayo ng setters and getters, okay na yan. Wala ka na. Kumbaga, mas mapapadali nyo. Diba? Mas mapapadali nyo yung program nyo. Try din natin itong i-modify. Let's try to modify this problem in which we will add here another part. Siguro, let me remove this one. Pero instead, I'll ask the user to input something. Util the scanner. Yan. For example, dito, si sandwich, tatawagin ko ngayon si data na method. Ayan. Yeah. So, si sandwich object natin, tatawagin natin si get data method na to. So, since method ito, I can now create a method inside this class here. So, public static sandwich. I'm using the employee as a data type, di ba? Public static sandwich. Yung parang ito yon, yung pinapakita ko ngayon, ito. Itong part na to. Okay? So, I have public static sandwich and get data. Now, the sandwich here will now have the value of S that will simply get everything. Ang i-return natin dito is si return S natin. I-return natin. Pero what is S? What is actually the S? This will be the setters later on. So, let's declare here the string ingredient. Let's declare bread. Let's also declare the price, double PR. Tapos gawin natin si scanner natin. We should know how to create scanner, di ba? New scanner system.in. Yan. Now, let's create here system.out.println. Let's ask the user to enter the main ingredient. And so, enter the main ingredient. Ilagay natin yung kay ingredient na variable. Tapos, keyboard.next line. Ayan. Next, gawin natin ulit to kay bread naman. So, enter the bread type. Enter the bread type. Pero this time, the variable will be bread. Ayan. And enter the price. And enter the price. The price will now get, or the PR will now get the value. Ayun. So far, ito may error dito. This is not next line, but instead, next double. There you go. Okay? So we have here the following inputs. So all we have to do is to put or use the S variable, which is actually in sandwich. Itong S na to, kinukuha natin itong sandwich ito as data type. Diba? So S, let's set main ingredient. Bato natin si ganyan. Lagay din natin ito kay bread type. Set bread type. And set bread type as the bread. Set the price or set price as PR and return S. Ayan. This is actually very amazing because ang mangyari dito is that whatever the values we have actually inputted here, it will now be stored in a single data type, which is that contains the value. Yan, information hiding yan, di ba? That contains the different values that we have actually inputted from our keyboard. So the S here will now be returning back to this line of code. So kung ano man yung pinagtatype natin dito, itong S na to, and kukunin niya natin dito. It will now be transferred back to the getters. This is actually the setters. This is the getters, tinatawag. So run natin yan. Etong constructor na to, this will serve as a default. So kapag wala kang tinype, ito ang magpapakita. Or pagka hindi mo pinerform lahat ito, yun yung magpapakita. Ito yung magpapakitang value ni get natin. So import natin, run. And so enter main ingredients. For example, we have here tuna. And bread type is like around wheat. Price is $4.99. There you go. Diba? Nakuha ba natin yun? Diba? Ganyan po ang concept ng object-oriented programming natin. So, let's move dito sa part ng problem natin. You have to submit a screenshot of your code with corresponding comments per line. Okay. So, create a Java class named Working Student that has fields for an ID number, number of hours earned, and number of points. So, you have class name, diba? May mga class name ka na. Pinapakita ko rin agad dito kung ano yung mga data fields. So, ID number, number of hours earned, number of points. So, for example, many universities compute grade point average based on a scale of 4. So, madali lang naman ito. A 3 credit hour class in which a student earned, and A is worth 12 points. Pakita ko to i-pull out ko lang yung i-pull out ko lang yung sample output para makita nyo. Show student, working student. Ito. Pakita ko kung paano sa inyo, kung paano gumana to, no? Yan. So, I have here the student ID, the number of hours, the point, and the grade point average is simply 12 divided by 3. As simple as that. Kasi according here, the show working student, it will now instantiate the student from, itong working student from the class you have created and assign values to its fields. So, compute the student grade point average and display all the values associated with the student. So, paano nag-compute yan? The points divided by the hours. As simple as that. Okay, but the challenge here is number 3. Create a constructor for the student class you created. The constructor should initialize each student's ID number to 9999, his or her points earned to 12, and credit hours to 3. So, pakita ko ang sample output natin. Madali lang ito, huwag kayo nag-overthink. Kumbaga kung paano yung example natin sa sandwich program, that's how you do it, pero with an additional steps. Yan. So, student ID, 12, and the point is 12, hours is 2, grade point average is 6. So, 12 divided by 2 lang siya. Okay, syempre. Ayan. Ito ang papakita ko lang, yung show student 2. Diba? So, yung show student 2 natin, napaka-iksi. Yan lang naman siya. So, I have instantiated here, this one, show ID number, show hour, show points, and there you go. So, may tatlo lang kayong data fields na gagawin. Alright? Any questions so far?